Thank you to those of us who have joined on Zoom. My name is Jason Miller, and I'm the Director of Campaigns and Development at the Franciscan Action Network and the WISC co-chair of the Faithful Democracy Coalition. You can find out more about our work around voting rights and campaign finance at our new website, faithfuldemocracy.us. And a big thank you to our sponsors today, the Washington Interfaith Staff Community, Faithful Democracy, and the Religious Action Center of Reformed Judaism. And with that, Rabbi Pesner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jason. Really appreciate the work of Faithful Democracy and the Washington Interfaith Staff Community. I am Rabbi Jonah Pesner, the Director of the Religious Action Center of Reformed Judaism and the Vice President of the Union for Reformed Judaism, the largest and most diverse denomination in Jewish life. So honored to be joined by our interfaith civil rights allies across the spectrum today to convene to help you, clergy and faith leaders from across the religious interfaith spectrum, think about how we can, at this very pivotal moment in American history, facing a very polarized and partisan moment in electoral politics, how we can help protect democracy and make sure that, as we've been saying in the Reformed Jewish movement, that every voice must be heard and every vote must be counted. So we have come together, most of us lead 501c3 nonpartisan faith-based organizations, congregations, and institutions that are dedicated to social justice and the common good, and seek to make sure that our vision for a better world can be realized through the protection of that most elemental American good, which is democracy. I come to you leading the Religious Action Center of Reformed Judaism, the site of the drafting of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And I say that to invoke the names of Congressman John Lewis, C.T. Vivian, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who spent their entire lives fighting for the right of every person to have their voice heard and their vote counted. So we have reached out to faith leaders across the spectrum to become part of the important work in a nonpartisan way of making sure that on the ground, even as we confront threats to this election, whether it's the threat of violence or of these so-called militias or poll watchers or disinformation that's happening, or the delegitimization of very important democratic tools like early voting or mail-in voting, it's important that we as faith leaders come together to understand how we can work with our congregations and institutions to protect voting rights and to protect democracy. We're going to hear from an esteemed group of civil rights and faith leaders to understand concretely what is at stake, what are the threats, and how we as faith leaders can respond. I'm going to introduce each of the panelists just before they speak so you understand who they are just before they offer their words. First, I'm going to introduce my beloved friend and colleague, Vinita Gupta, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights. Vinita is an experienced leader and litigator who's devoted her entire career to civil rights work. From 2014 to 2017, she was the acting Assistant Attorney General and head of the US Department of Civil Rights Division, appointed by President Barack Obama. She oversaw a wide range of criminal and civil enforcement efforts to ensure equal justice and protect equal opportunity. I've come to know Vinita in her more recent role, which is the head of the Leadership Conference. The reason the Voting Rights Act was drafted in our conference room, it was because the Leadership Conference wrote that act in our offices where we played host to the Leadership Conference. Vinita has been at the leading edge of democracy protection work these last 3 years during her tenure. And we're so grateful, Vinita, that you can spend some time with us now.
I'm really grateful, Rabbi Pesner, both for your friendship and leadership and for the fact that you're convening this group. And of course, as soon as I talk, there's a lawnmower on my neighbor's lawn. So hopefully you can't hear it, but it is really loud over here. So I may not be able to hear myself, y'all.
You're fine.
But thank you all for joining this meeting today. There are many of our organizations that are very hard at work, both to protect voters, to make sure that all eligible voters are able to cast their ballots, however they choose to do so in this unprecedented election where we are hit by the global pandemic of COVID, and also, though, protecting the legitimacy of a free and fair election. I say this election is unprecedented not only because, in March when COVID came to our shores, or at least we started to really talk about COVID in our shores, and as states began to postpone primaries in light of the pandemic, the civil rights community immediately went to work to try to do everything we can via advocacy, litigation, to expand voting options for voters. And it has meant making sure that states have appropriate vote by mail systems in place that don't inadvertently disenfranchise people of color who may or may not have a culture and history and trust in voting by mail. That has involved things like standing up vote by mail systems with prepaid postage and getting states to change rules to make sure that ballots that are postmarked on or by election day can still be counted within a reasonable amount of time after the election, working to ensure drop boxes around the country. Marcia will talk about the Lawyers Committee's litigation in these efforts. There's been a lot of organizations hard at work in this moment to expand those options, but also to make sure that states are expanding in-person options so that there can be safe, socially distanced voting in person. Unfortunately, we continue to see enormously long lines around the country, both, yes, as a result of voter enthusiasm and turnout, but also because we still are not in a place in this country and have not committed to ending the scourge of long lines in our communities. And that will be the long game. But we've been working to make sure that there are poll workers around the country. The Leadership Conference has partnered up with Power the Polls to make sure that we have adequate numbers of poll workers in election sites. We just today, actually this evening, are going to be doing supplemental training for 58,000 people that have signed up just today for this training. There are many, many more. I think it's somewhere around 700 or 800,000 people that have signed up through Power the Polls to be poll workers. But we need poll workers, and younger poll workers, typically they tend to be retirees, more vulnerable to COVID. Without poll workers at polling places, we will continue to see polling places close. As you all know, there's been a systematic set of closings of polling places ever since 2013, when the United States Supreme Court gutted the heart of the Voting Rights Act in a devastating decision. But amid a pandemic now, even more than before, it is important that we have people in polling places that are trained, equipped, have PPE to be able to help assist voters who need assistance. And then we've been working to extend online voter registration in states around the country. So these are some of the mechanisms, and all of this work beforehand is aimed at mitigating concerns around which ballots are going to be counted, which ones are going to be rejected after the election. It is incumbent on all of us that, in the face, unfortunately, of a president who has, for the last several months, led a disinformation campaign about the safety and security of mail-in ballots. They are very safe, very secure. States like Colorado, Hawaii, Oregon, Washington, Utah are among those states that for years have been using mail-in ballots to vote without any serious incident. And many more states that have been using it, actually, at least as an option for voters for years. That this disinformation campaign is aimed at suppressing and scaring voters. And in this moment, as faith leaders in your communities, the number one message, and I cannot repeat this enough, is not to focus on the threats that we are maybe facing or the fears that we may have, but is a single message, which is for voters to make a plan to vote and to vote. In this moment, voter confidence is crucial to ensuring voter turnout. And any talk of threats and fears is only going to create alarm and could end up having the suppressive effect that some, unfortunately, would love it to have. And so making sure that we are putting out pro-voting messages, and understanding too that even kind of on the theoretical level, that the best inoculation against all of this disinformation and any threats of authoritarianism seeping in that some of us are deeply concerned about, the greatest inoculation is high voter turnout to this. It will take out the kind of the potential for a close contested election. It could take the wind out of any disinformation efforts. And so I think as faith leaders, you all have very unique kind of positions in your communities. Putting out and doing everything you can to have pro-voter messages is really important. There's been also a concern around voter intimidation in this moment before the election. And on the voter intimidation front, it is 100%, regardless of what you may be hearing a Supreme Court nominee saying or the president and vice president, voter intimidation is against the law. And there are resources that I will give to Rabbi Pezner. There have been some really great resources put together that break down what voter intimidation is, and that we have been lifting up 866 Our Vote, which Marcia will talk about, that if voters encounter problems in voting or they encounter concerns about this, that they are able to call 866 Our Vote, but also that there are election officials that are in every one of your communities that I would urge you to develop relationships with right now. Know who they are, know their names, and have their cell phone numbers, and make yourselves available for the potential to help de-escalate if it's necessary, or to at least make connections. If people in your congregations are expressing things to you, that you have a way to get that information to election officials. There may be times, and not everyone's going to feel comfortable with this, I understand, but where calling law enforcement is going to matter. Obviously, that's going to be there's going to be individual relationships of trust involved in that. The Leadership Conference has been doing a series of briefings for US mayors around the country and law enforcement leaders to understand the do's and don'ts around voter intimidation. There have been other groups that we've been working with too to do this. State attorneys generals are involved and governors are involved. We've been doing a lot of work to help kind of prepare folks for protecting voter safety and for protecting the right to vote, and ensuring that all votes and ballots will be counted after the election. And so I just think as faith leader, let me just say this in winding down, and I'm sure there'll be questions, but making sure that you also have the resources that you need, whether it's knowing the 866 Our Vote number, whether it's knowing your state and local election officials and making those relationships and connections now, understanding if you can use some of the resources that we'll send to you about voter intimidation and armed militias. There have been great resources put together on this. I would urge you not to talk about these things publicly to scare voters, but to at least have those resources, and maybe even engage your local law enforcement if you feel comfortable, and only if you feel comfortable about this, and that you're, on the do's and don'ts. It's helpful to have additional messaging on that. And then to be a go-to resource for your communities to help them make a plan, vote.org or iwillvote.com. There's a lot of different resources that are a 50-state one-stop shop, has all the information to assist and support voters. And then poll worker recruitment. If that's something that young people in your congregations are interested in doing, even outside of voting, I would urge you to do that. And then, because I have this, today is the last day to fill out the census. There have been all kinds of shenanigans on the census, but if you are able to get out a message to your congregations today, there's 24 hours before the census will stop enumerating or counting people. 2020census.gov, you can go there. It's got the phone number that people can use to fill it out if they want to do this by phone. But 2020census.gov is also a way to fill it out online. And so these are some of the efforts, Rabbi Pezner, that I wanted to lift up, and I'm happy to respond to people's questions. And I'm grateful to the broad civil rights community and faith community that is in the Leadership Conference that is going to be, working together closely on all of this, even in real time.
Fantastic. Thank you, Vinita Gupta. Now everybody knows why I love you so much, and I'm honored to serve on your board. I think I've already heard 5 or 6 concrete things that we as faith leaders can do right now to protect democracy. At the end of the call, I'll try and summarize where we are. I do want to point out that the Q&A box is open. So if you have questions for Vinita or specific issues you want her to address, post them in the Q&A. I'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout the webinar as the conversation continues. Go ahead,
Sorry.
Vinita.
just one more thing, which is there is I'm sorry, I completely forgot to say this. We are also plugged in and coordinating a pretty significant people mobilization effort that if there's a concern around ballots not being counted in particular jurisdictions, we know there's a lot of energy in our communities to make sure that every vote is counted. We have been helping with organizations that are part of this consortium called Fight Back Table and some others to train activists on nonviolent protests and mobilization to make sure that they have support. There are 12 states that we're focused on in particular where we are concerned because they may be close calls around, and there are organizations in those states that are anchoring this work and the mobilizations, and we're doing work to support them. Rabbi Pesner, I know you know a little bit about this, but I would love to be able to send you a way for faith leaders to plug into that at the local level, because I think that could be enormously helpful. And then we're also coordinating at the leadership conference a communications table around the contested election scenarios. And I will make sure that WISC and you all are able to access those daily messages, all nonpartisan, but making sure that we are kind of messaging out in a unified and aligned way. And so I wanted to mention both of those things as well.
Great, thank you, Vinita. Totally appreciate your adding more. Folks may have thought we were going to hear from Kristen Clark from the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. We have upgraded. Marcia Johnson Blanco is a rock star because she leads the volunteer efforts. We've been working with the Lawyers Committee with our own religious denomination to recruit lawyers and even non-lawyers to help do voter protection work. So Marcia, I'm going to briefly just share that you are the head of the Lawyers Committee Voting Rights Project. She manages the project's programmatic and advocacy portfolios, leading election protection, the nation's largest nonpartisan voter protection program. Welcome, Marcia Johnson Blanco. Thank you for being with us. And what can you tell us about the Lawyers Committee's efforts? And also if you can reference Lawyers and Collars, our partners with the Skinner Institute and Sojourners.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Pesner, for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity to talk about the work of election protection. As you noted, it's a nonpartisan voter protection program, the nation's largest, that consists of national organizations, state and local organizations, and the private bar coming together to protect the right to vote, to ensure that voters can cast the ballot, and also, as importantly, to ensure that the ballot will be counted. And the efforts of election protection are centered around a suite of voter protection hotlines. The Lawyers Committee administers the 866 Our Vote hotline, which is the English language speaking hotline, but we work and are in partnership with partners who administer Spanish language, Asian languages, as many as 17 Asian languages, and Arabic language net hotline as well. And then we also are working with the disability community to make sure that voters with disabilities are supported as well. In addition to the hotlines, we are organizing field programs in now 39 states. It keeps increasing the number of states where we're providing in-person support. And the focus of these efforts are to empower voters. I just want to build on some of the things that Vinita mentioned. It's really important in the very divisive climate we are in, and in a climate where there's a lot of misinformation about the vote, that voters have the information they need about the process. We are finding that now, because of the pandemic, many voters are voting by mail for the very first time. And it's really important that voters follow the instructions precisely in their vote by mail process, because we're finding that jurisdictions are rejecting vote by mail ballots, not because of eligibility concerns, but because, for example, the voter didn't put the ballot in the security envelope. They used purple ink instead of black ink. They didn't sign their signature may not have matched the signature they have on their voter registration card. Or in a family, the family puts several ballots in the same envelope. All of these types of practices can be disqualifying. And if anyone has any questions about um, the process of voting, that's where the hotlines come in. The hotlines are a means to report, to get information about voting. You heard Vinita said about making a plan to vote. It's more important than ever to stress this for voters, to make a plan. And if they have any questions at all about the process, what they need to do to make that plan, to verify their voter registration, how to vote by mail, where to vote on November 3rd, that's where the hotlines come in to provide resources. Vinita also mentioned that it's part of the work we do. We're also involved in litigation, and I just want to highlight a couple of the cases we were recently involved in and why this making a plan and knowing how to vote is so important. Both Ohio and Texas instituted laws that there could only be one drop-off box for ballots per county. So you have the most populous counties being treated the same as the least populous counties and not giving proportionate opportunities to drop off a ballot. And we brought litigation in those cases. And unfortunately, because our courts have been changing in past cycles where we would have been successful in these types of cases, we weren't, with courts allowing election officials to effectively limit the opportunity to cast a ballot. We also became aware in Georgia through our partners on the ground about any litigation that had been filed in state court very quietly, asking the county, Fulton County, to purge thousands of voters from the voter rolls. And this was in clear violation of the National Voter Registration Act. And we were able to, we tried to intervene. Our motion was not accepted, but the very same day the judge dismissed the case. And this, they're actually appealing the dismissal of the case, but and it's eye-opening. We don't know how many of these efforts are happening, but we want to make sure that voters verify and check their voter registration so they don't have any nasty surprises when they go to vote because of efforts such as these. I also want to talk about the messaging and just really reiterate how important it is for us, our messaging, to focus on how you can vote safely and securely. There are lots of efforts on the ground and conversations that are happening with law enforcement. And as Vinita did, I urge you to have these conversations about election officials, law enforcement. What is your plan to make sure that the vote, that polls on election day are safe and secure? Because that has to be our focus and our messaging to voters. Here are the opportunities, whether it's vote by mail or in person. Here's how you do it. And we're focused on making sure that that is safe and secure. As Rabbi Pesner mentioned, we are partnered with an effort called Lawyers and Callers. It's an effort that is spearheaded by the African American Clergy Network and Sojourners in target states. And part of these, the campaign is We Are Watching. And they will have a clergy, a faith presence at polling places to encourage voters to vote, and frankly, to be a deterrent for those who want to create intimidation or violence at polling places. One of the experts who work on studying militias noted that one of the biggest deterrents for violence intimidation at the polling place is a joyful atmosphere. And just being there and being present can actually be a deterrent. You don't even have to do anything else because it doesn't an environment that invites the type of disruption that they want to see, and they've seen them, step aside and turn away because the environment wasn't conducive to what they wanted to produce in the moment. The other thing that I just want to mention as well is this messaging about the legitimacy of the means in which we vote. That so has to be reinforced because we are going to be in an election cycle where we are, it's unlikely that in every state we're going to know the results of the election on November 3rd. And just explaining to people that this is fine, it's legitimate, and countering the message that we're hearing that somehow vote by mail is not an acceptable form to voting, or not knowing the results on election night is not acceptable because of the pandemic. Jurisdictions have to pivot to vote by mail. And unfortunately, we haven't provided the resources that our election officials really need in order to be able to process these ballots in a timely way. And so it's going to take some time to know the results. And so it's really important for us to collectively counter any messaging that suggests that the means of which we legitimately vote are fraudulent or in any way calls into question the results. We're also seeing such robust participation in voting already. I'm not sure what the latest number is, but earlier this week it was, 8 million people had already voted. And so we can expect that this voting enthusiasm is going to continue on to November 3rd. And we will have long lines. And it's really important to encourage people to stay in those lines, particularly at the end of polling hours. If anyone is in line at the end of polling hours, they have to be given the opportunity to vote. And if they're not, we stand ready. We're putting together a core of local counsel to bring emergent litigation as needed to ensure that polls stay open, or if there are any issues with voting at the beginning of the day, that there are opportunities that are extended to vote at the end of the day. And so we want to encourage people not to be discouraged by a process where, unfortunately, we are not really, frankly, equipped to deal with robust turnout at polling places, and long lines will be a factor. We're seeing it now in early voting, and people have been committed and staying in line, and we're going to see that on election day as well. And lastly, I do want to mention that Election Protection is working on a guidance, which when we finalize, we will share with Rabbi Pesner and WISC about how to document and how to counter violence and intimidation at the polls. And again, the goal of this is not to lift up nefarious plans, because that could have a chilling effect, as Vinita noted, but for us to be informed and aware about what we can do to ensure the safety of our communities. And I'll stop there. I'm very happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great, Marcia, thank you so much. I love what you said about being a joyful presence at the polls. With the rising threats of white supremacy, if we can retain joy and pride in our democracy, this would be one good outcome of this election. Again, many concrete things that we as faith leaders can do to protect democracy. People are posting in the Q&A. Keep asking your questions. We're answering them as we go, and we'll also have time at the end to surface some of the questions for the larger group. Reverend Jennifer Butler is an incredible partner and ally in this work. Faith in public life is such an important way of amplifying faith voices for the values and the policies that we care about to make the world more just. She is the founding executive director of Faith in Public Life, and former chair of the White House Council on Faith and Neighborhood Partnerships. Reverend Jennifer Butler, teach us your Torah about election protection as faith leaders.
Great, thank you so much, Jonah, and thanks so much for hosting this webinar. I know these are anxious times, and I feel so calmed and even overjoyed when I gather with these incredible colleagues, and when I see the number of people calling into this webinar. The Rabbi Jason Kimmelman Block often says we were made for this moment. And the thing I've been reflecting on is how our scripture really is a handbook for resisting tyranny, from the book of Exodus all the way through to resisting empires along the way, and years of wandering in the wilderness. And so we're in a wilderness moment, but I believe that this could be a turning point and a good way for our nation as we really begin to look at some of the challenges we're facing and begin to become the democracy that we've striven for, but never quite attained. And so what I want to talk about is some election messaging strategy, sort of building on what Vinita and what Marcia have been talking about, how to talk to your congregations about what is going on and to your communities and neighbors about what is going on. And then I want to offer some ways to continue to plug in, because faith leaders are organizing and we're producing more and more materials and training opportunities. And so I'll let you know what's happening here. Just to see the outpouring of, you know, what Leadership Conference and what Marcia is doing. Like there are so many people coming together in this moment, and I hope that's heartening as well. And so you'll find some ways to plug in. So the main thing that just to start with is that you all are very trusted messengers. You have enormous platforms. And the main thing that we can start to do right now is to model calm, thoughtfulness, and principle. And that work begins now. It'll continue through the election, but we've got to start preparing our folks now. So the next slide, our goals are really to instill patience among our networks, to shift voter expectations, as Marcia and Vinita have been indicating, that we are facing an election season, not just an election day. And so the election results may take time to come in, and to really keep people patient and calm, especially initially to, and one of the questions I think Bill was asking about, you know, just shift people's expectations for what this is going to look like. We will not know the results of the election necessarily on November 3rd. There'll be a bigger window for that. Impart understanding to your constituents, provide voters with information about why a ballot counting period is necessary, help them be more understanding of election officials. And so a little education about what the process is going to look like, just to shore up trust in the system. And coming from you as a faith leader, I think that is going to help people on all sides to remain calm. We want to inspire confidence, affirm the voters' confidence in the integrity of the election through a ballot counting period that might last 7 to 10 days. And, you know, at the same time, you know, not suggesting that they overlook some of the partisan dynamics involved, and to help people begin to analyze what it takes to create a strong democracy, and to be realistic about some of the efforts to undermine and to educate people about what's happening in our election system. And then motivate folks to support the idea of counting every vote. As we move to the next slide, that is the thing I really want to emphasize, is that message testing has been done by the Voting Rights Lab. And the top message frame really is this mantra or message of every voice should be heard, every vote should be counted. So that is the mantra, the core message to really put on your wall. Every voice should be heard. And of course, that really lends itself to our theology and to our faith traditions and the way we talk about human dignity. Every voice, every human being matters. And in the green box here, and I can send this around after the webinar, is the sort of paragraph that they came up with that is the core message that works the best. And so you can kind of take that in. When election officials take the time to count and verify every ballot, that's a sign that our democracy is working. The idea of not rushing to make announcements about who has won the election, that it takes time and we need to count every vote and hear every voice. So that's going to be the top message. And as you can see, that's been tested and polled, and it works among various constituency groups. So sorry, my dog is come in and is nudging me, so take care of that. The next slide. So the next steps will be helping, working with others to disseminate more faith-specific messaging, to be doing trainings, and to be doing mobilizations. If we go to the next slide, you'll see, Vinita mentioned toward the end of her remarks that there are different kinds of groups getting together and sort of planning how to take on this this situation. Right now, there are national faith organizations that are gathering every Friday at 11 a.m. to work on building out a plan. And to join this working group, you can just email organizing@faithandpubliclife.org. We've broken into small groups and or into working groups rather, and we're outlining materials and training opportunities together. And so if you want to join that, you're welcome to join that table. The next slide, there's a broader, related to the Fight Back table that Vinita Gupta mentioned, is the Count Every Vote Faith Network, which is a project that is going to be organizing faith organizations to plug in to defend democracy. We're going to be working in 12 key states and 5 key cities. And those are listed below. And they actually we're offering a grant opportunity. The application is linked there in the PowerPoint, and we'll send that around afterwards as well. You have to apply. It's a very short application within the next 72 hours. Sorry for the quick turnaround, but of course, this has just come about and we're all moving very fast. So applications are due Friday, but if there's some work that you want to do in any of the states that are listed below, and the cities as well, then you're welcome to apply for that. And then we'll be doing a couple of upcoming trainings here that you can see on the slide. And again, if you're trying to figure out how to plug in with your local state efforts, every state is going to have a sort of fight back table, a coordinated effort, because every state is unique. And so if you're in one of those states that was listed, email the email down at the bottom here, organizing@faithandpubliclife.org. We can help, we can send you that list of who to plug in with in your state. Or if you want to join the Every Friday group that is meeting to do some planning. If you have any question whatsoever, we're happy to ask it as well. So we want to plug you into the efforts that you feel most called to do. And there's so many different ways, as you can hear from this training opportunity, there's so many ways for all of us to plug in and to do what God is calling us to do in this moment. So we're all part of a big team, and it's exciting to be moving forward together. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Jennifer Butler, not just for that incredibly cogent presentation, but for all the work you've been doing to empower faith leaders to make a difference in this moment. So glad that our Reformed Jewish messaging is consistent, because our civic engagement campaign is called Every Voice, Every Vote, which for the Jewish attendees to this discussion know is a play on the Hebrew kol kolot, because in Hebrew, the same word kol can mean vote or can mean voice. So anyway, a little yummy intersectionality right there for you, Reverend Butler.
Love it. Love it.
Also, just appreciate the grounding of Reverend Butler's comments in the biblical text, in the scripture in Exodus. For people that want more, if you visit the RAC's website and you click on the civic engagement, there's all these Jewish textual resources around democracy and voting rights. Many of them are biblical texts that, if you're in any of the 3 Abrahamic traditions, would be useful for your congregations or communities. With that, we're going to transition to our final speaker. And I would remind people, if you have questions, post them in the Q&A. We've been answering them as we go, and we'll do a few more at the end. But we want to pivot now to Chris Crawford from the Democracy Fund. And what I love about working with Chris Crawford is he understands the role of the faith community in protecting and preserving democracy. Chris is the Senior Program Associate for Constructive Politics at Democracy Fund, which is an independent foundation working to ensure that our political system is able to withstand new challenges and deliver on its promise to the American people. In that role, he manages the Faith in Democracy portfolio, a collection of faith-based initiatives to empower religious leaders in their communities to promote pluralism and strengthen our democracy. Thank you so much, Chris Crawford, for being part of this conversation.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to make sure I have all my text set up. Can you hear me?
Sound great.
And can you see my slides?
We see your slides.
Awesome. Well, thank you all very much. And I do want to start by just saying to everyone who's on the call, as you are working to lift up your neighbors, your communities in such a difficult time on so many different fronts, I want to thank you and let you know that I'm lifting up all of you in prayer, and want to remind you all to take care of yourselves as you're taking care of your communities. As Rabbi said, I'm Chris Crawford from Democracy Fund, and in addition to my work at Democracy Fund, I'm working with the National Task Force on Election Crises in their outreach to faith communities. They are a group of bipartisan leaders that have one goal and one goal only, which is a free and fair election. And what I'd like to talk to you about today is their 6 elements of a successful election and what that looks like. And I'd start by saying the one thing to do is listen to everyone who's spoken already on this panel. They've covered a lot of the ground that I'm going to cover, and just hit on a few of these points. The first one is that conducting a free and fair election should not become a partisan issue. Every political party should be dedicated to that. Second is that all eligible voters are able to vote and have their votes counted. This has been the sweet spot for religious activism throughout our history. I have my Good Trouble pin on today to celebrate that fact. And this year, I have been incredibly inspired by people on this call and folks across the country engaging through their faith to protect the right to vote. As Reverend Jim Wallace and Dr. Barbara Williams Skinner tell us, protecting the right to vote affirms the divine imprint and inherent value of all of God's children. Third is that the election is conducted according to the laws of the land. And those are the laws at every level. And I think civil society and faith leaders need to hold our leaders accountable to those laws. Fourth is that Americans receive timely and accurate information about the election. Our elected officials and election administrators should give timely and accurate information to ensure a smoothly run election. Our media should report on where, how, and when folks can vote. And each of us have a very particular responsibility to be sources of trustworthy information and to not spread inaccurate information intentionally or otherwise. The point's been made today that faith leaders are trusted sources of information. And so we should all be thinking of the ways that we can proactively share who those sources are for trusted information related to voting and related to getting the election results so that people know where to turn, because the best way to prevent against misinformation is to teach people where they can turn for accurate information. Fifth is that officials can take the time to count every vote, especially when it may take longer than usual. This point has been covered very well, and I just want to hit it one more time, that if you have one takeaway from my brief time with you today, let it be that every vote must be counted. And when people ask you, what is the most important indicator of a successful election over the coming weeks, it should be that every vote is counted. And I like the language too of every voice should be heard. Due to the pandemic, as has been covered on this call, the ballots are going to take a longer time to be counted, the absentee ballots in particular. Each state has different rules that have to be followed. So we do have to set that expectation that the counting of the votes is going to take longer. And if anyone doesn't give the system time to work, we need to resist any attempts to shut down that counting process. And if those attempts do happen, they should be met with those words. I'll say it one more time. Every vote must be counted. The sixth and the final item that I want to cover today is that officials, the media, and others should avoid making bad faith and unsubstantiated claims about rigging or stealing the election. Words like rigging and stealing have precise meanings and enormous weight. Candidates, pundits, and other leaders should not make claims of a rigged or stolen election in an attempt to undermine our elections, to deflect responsibility for the results, or to promote false narratives. In a successful election, we have to have confidence that every eligible person can vote and that every vote is going to be counted. Any attempts to undermine that system must be met both by the force of law as well as a civil society, including faith communities, that are mobilized to secure our democracy. But making unsubstantiated claims harms our ability to protect against those real threats and serves to undermine an election process that we do expect to be free, fair, and trusted. I just want to close by pointing you to some resources and thanking you once again. If you would like to see the task force's information and resources, you can go to electiontaskforce.org. And also, please feel free to email me, ccrawford@democracyfund.org. I send out a weekly email to faith leaders that includes information from the task force as well as other organizations. And I really am just trying to help faith leaders find their voice in any way that I can in the coming weeks. So please feel free to email me if I can be helpful at all. And I want to thank you all again. Thank you, Rabbi, for hosting, and thank you everyone for tuning in. Thank you.
Chris, you're welcome. And we see from your headshot that you have lost your tie, but gained a beard during the pandemic. So well played. Folks, we have just about 12 minutes left. Many of the questions that you've posted in the chat, we've actually been able to answer as we go. So I'm gonna actually do this a little bit differently. We have about 2 to 3 minutes for each of our panel, actually 3 minutes for each of our panelists to offer a closing reflection. And in that closing reflection, you can choose to either answer some of the questions that have come up with the themes in the chat, or you can build on things you've heard from one another. So I'm gonna, I think, go in reverse order that we started. Chris, if I can kind of keep you on the hook. Anything else that you want to add, either from what you've seen in the Q&A, posted in the chat, or heard from the other panelists?
My gosh, I'm really feeling a spirit of gratitude. So I think I'll start my closing by just thanking everyone who's been a part of this panel, and thank you for including me. And just a last comment on, there's a lot of things that we are afraid of, and a lot of examples of poor leadership, of people not taking some of these crises seriously, not trying to step up in a difficult year for the election. But I don't want us to lose the fact that so many people across the country at all levels of leadership, especially election administrators, volunteers, the hundreds of thousands of people signing up to work at the polls for the first time, people registering to vote for the first time. I don't want to overlook the incredible work that is being done that has been inspiring me and has been amazing me, especially the folks on this call today. So I want to just remind people to look for the great work that's been happening, recognize it, and also find a way to add your voice and your activism as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And note, one of the last questions was, will someone send out Chris Crawford's list? So let me say, Chris, you can go on the Q&A and you can post in the question box right now, but also we will, after this webinar is over, we're gonna post this as a public YouTube and encourage all 100 of you who've logged in today to share it out with your network so that clergy on the ground, faith leaders on the ground can have access to it. And we'll also add the resources that have been shared. Vinita emailed me offline links to all of the stuff that she talked about. So we'll supply all of that. Meanwhile, Reverend Jennifer Butler, a closing reflection.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize how important the faith and moral voice is in this moment. Because, you know, as I said up front, we really walk in the footsteps of those who have resisted tyranny throughout the ages. And in fact, I just wrote a book, if I can do a book plug, on reclaiming the Bible as a handbook for resisting tyranny. And it's oriented in particular at those of us who have been working in Christian communities as well, where the Bible has often been hijacked. So the main title is Who Stole My Bible? And you can find it on Amazon. But I do hope we take confidence in the fact that we really do walk in a great cloud of witnesses throughout history who have overcome impossible odds and prevailed. So let's be out there giving people hope and confidence in this moment.
Thank you, Reverend Butler. Inspiring way to close. Marcia.
Yes, first I want to thank you for having me be a part of this very important conversation. I'm really inspired by the amount of people who've participated, and I really see our work with the faith community as being one of the most important things that we do, because the faith community has the moral authority and has historically always been at the forefront of ensuring justice and access to equality. So I'm really happy to be in partnership with you and look forward to sharing all of our resources and being help to you. I just would like to quickly answer the question from my old friend Bert, who has been involved in election protection. many moons ago, that the election protection hotline is going to be available after the election to help with ballot curing questions that voters may have. So while we're not reaching out affirmatively, the hotline is a resource for voters, and we should definitely invite you to promote that for them to call should they have those questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Marcia. And again, Lawyers Committee really understands the value of the faith community. Lawyers and Callers is a great example of how we can have clergy leaders actually on the ground doing election protection work. So thank you, Marcia, for that partnership. Vinita, you will get the penultimate word. I'm gonna, at the end, wrap things up and then kick it to Sister Quincy to close us out.
Now, I just would echo what my great colleagues who've already just spoken have said. There's a role for all of us to play in protecting our democracy. This is a nonpartisan civil rights moral moment for our nation. And faith leaders are in some ways the best situated of all of us to ensure, and have always played a role in this, but to ensure that every voice can be heard, every vote can be counted, that we can have peace and safety for voters in our communities, but also understanding. And I think we have to be mindful. We're in an incredibly polarized time in our nation. Emotions are running high, and ensuring faith community engagement, and that you all have the support you need, however we can help support. I'm grateful always to Rabbi Pesner for pulling these kinds of calls together. If there are other venues and fora for us to be getting this message out, we will seek to do so. But I want to show appreciation, and that in this moment, one of the most important things that we can do is to instill hope and joy, as Marcia said, in voting and understanding, though, what's at stake, because there is so much, perhaps not to overstate it, I think everything is at stake in this moment. And so thank you all for your engagement and for your leadership.
Thanks, Vinita. And you're having invoked earlier the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which is personal to us at the Religious Action Center because we were your partners in its creation. In the memory of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I want to remind people of the words that she spoke in dissent, which was that the logic of the court, which argued things are better now, she said, that's like standing in a rainstorm protected by an umbrella and saying, gee, I guess I don't need my umbrella anymore because I'm not getting wet. The dissent, as she taught us, was the hope for future generations of what's possible. We are in a tsunami of threats against democracy. And the joyful, prophetic, and hopeful leadership that we heard about today is our umbrella. We stand underneath a canopy of faith and thousands of years of religious wisdom that can guide us in this moment. So thank you for joining. One last pitch. I'm looking at the list of attendees. Many of you are denominational leaders and have platforms with extensive networks. Please get this information and these resources out to the clergy and faith leaders on the ground who are actually being asked by their congregations and their communities what this moment means and how they can help. That's the opportunity that the esteemed group of colleagues on this call have. Again, we'll follow up with a YouTube link and with other resources, but I urge you to leverage your platforms to get into the hands of faith leaders and clergy the tools and the equipment to be able to lean into this moment. With that, I'm appreciative on behalf of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, proudly a member of WISC, the Washington Interfaith Staff Community, and Faithful Democracy to have been part of this conversation. Thank you to all of our panelists. And the final word goes to Sister Quincy to close us out.
Thank you so much. An honor, which I do not deserve. It's been a huge privilege to be here with you all today. And we are so deeply grateful to our speakers for being here. We know how many demands there are on your time. And Marcia, I would like to update the number of how many people as of today have voted. It's at 15 million. Estimated 15 million people have cast their ballots. And that is despite the relentless efforts that we've been seeing to suppress the vote. So in COVID, the voting process is happening for weeks on end. And if it takes longer to count them, that means our democratic systems are working. Faith leaders have a unique role, as you've heard, in urging patience and steadfastness and waiting for the outcome. As things unfold, we're also called to follow the leadership of civil rights partners and communities of color with their deep historical wisdom in overcoming oppression and combating violence. So in 2020, it's time to live into the truth of a democracy where votes determine leadership and where peacemakers occupy the public square. We hope that this space has served to bolster your faith and determination that our democracy and this election are defined by the will of the people. We urge faith communities to join with people of goodwill across the nation to insist on an election in which all votes count, and as of November 3rd, in which all votes are then counted. So we thank you for joining us, and we hope that you're inspired to claim your place in ensuring a faithful democracy. And please, as Rabbi Pesner said, share these resources with any faith leaders that are in your circles. We need the word to get around. Thank you so much.